elaborate a bit more on the sort of the requirements within both the IMO and the EU? What do you measure? Is it about getting data on your emissions and then showing that, being transparent, or is it about do you also have requirements in terms of how much you can emit, and what is the
So the baseline, if you want, for both IMO and EU are their data collection system. The IMO has a data collection system which is called the IMO DCS database, and the EU has a EU MRV database.
What is that? Like those abbreviations, what do they stand for?
It's always like this.
Yeah.
Sustainability,
Yeah.
we have an alphabet soup of acronyms left and right.
Yeah.
I'm not going to bore you with the details, but the IMO's database is requiring shipping companies to report at an annual level on the fuel consumption of the ships on an annual basis, and this data is used to calculate the AER, which is the annual efficiency ratio, which tells me how much CO2 the vessel is emitting to transport itself. So the AER is based on the design of the ship, it's based on the dead weight of the ship, whereas the EU reporting system is based on the transport work. So that means that the EU requires from shipping companies to disclose the cargo quantity they are carrying, so that the emission metrics used is based on how much gram of CO2 we are emitting to transport 1 ton of cargo, to really be able to calculate the emission intensity of the trade, right? So of the cargo itself.
Yeah.
And the other difference between the two systems is that the IMO, it's an anonymized database.
Okay.
You cannot go in, access, look up the emission intensity of a ship, its annual fuel consumption, you can't.
Okay.
The EU, it's a public database, unanonymized, you can type in the IMO number. But the problem is that the EU MRV doesn't cover the world fleet. Not all the ships call into the EU, so not all ships are eligible under this data collection system.
No.
And then the third difference, which is kicking in actually as of this year, as of 2024, in the EU, you don't have to only capture CO2 emissions. The EU is also requiring the calculation of 2 additional greenhouse gases.
Okay.
So the CH4, which is methane, and N2O, which is nitrogen oxide. And the IMO has been pushed to start including this concept of CO2 equivalent to cover other gases, but hasn't committed to that yet.
Okay.
And then you also asked me, how does that work? Like, does it cap the amount of CO2 that you're allowed? So there is no cap on amount of CO2. The way we calculate those AER and emission intensity metrics, because if you remember at the start of the discussion, we talked about those curves that will allow us to get to net zero by 2050. We are going to measure the attained metric of a ship to how far or close it is to that curve.
Okay.
To be able to measure, or is that ship on track to meet the decarbonization target or not?
So it's actually the individual ship, in a way, the individual vessel, and the ability of that vessel to reach net zero, following a specific time curve of ambitions along the way until 2050.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
And actually on that topic, there is a great initiative. It's the Sea Cargo Charterer by the Global Maritime Forum, which is a voluntary initiative for charterers, and now they've also invited ship owners to participate in that group. And a measure that is really effective that they've been using is something we call the climate alignment delta.
Okay.
What does climate alignment delta? Climate alignment delta is the percentage difference between the ship's attained emission intensity metrics to that curve to get to net zero by 2050. So if you are, let's say, plus 12%, it means you are emitting 12% more than you should be if you want to be aligned with the decarbonization curve.
Yeah.
If you are minus 5.2%, let's say, you are doing great.
Yeah, you are ahead of the curve.
Exactly.
Yeah, okay. And how does that, because looking at individual vessels, but also looking at fleet, and then looking at sort of countries, how does that all correlate?
Yes.
How do we go from a vessel to a fleet and then into, I guess, a country like Denmark would also have our policy or our requirements for Danish ships to follow a specific curve, you could say.
That's a great point, and shipping is global. So unfortunately, when you have countries, again, like Denmark, that have set net zero or decarbonization targets for the country, it's very difficult to translate that back into shipping. This is why member states count on the IMO to have a global decarbonization target for shipping as a sector.
Yeah.
Because it's a bit, in shipping you have flag states, right? So let's say my ship is under Danish flag, but it's never sailing in and out of Denmark, maybe. It's maybe sailing between Houston and Singapore all year.
Yeah.
Why would my ship fall under the decarbonization targets of Denmark?
Yeah.
It's very difficult to start thinking about national policies.
Yeah.
So that's why member states are lobbying with the IMO to call for the IMO to have a global carbon tax, similar to the EU having implemented the EU carbon tax.
Yeah.
That way we can start regulating shipping with a level playing field, even level playing field, where there is no disbalance between the EU and the IMO, so that all shipping companies, irrespective of the member state, are playing on the same level when it comes to regulatory standards.
Yeah.
And to your question as well on how do we see the different fleet and segments of ships play out in the decarbonization. So actually, if you think about which ship types are most efficient, if you look at the sea cargo charter reports, for example, that are focusing just on tanker, bulk carrier and gas carrier, actually you have the tankers that are doing pretty well, and the problem is that the bulk carriers and the chemical carriers are not doing so well because of the way the ballast leg emission are allocated. So ballast leg is when the vessel is empty, going to a port to pick up cargo.
Yeah.
The way those emissions are allocated to the voyage emission metric is defavorizing the vessels.
Okay.
And we have a problem in the industry that hasn't been really solved yet, is how do you allocate the ballast leg emissions? Because let's say...
What do you mean by allocate?
Yes.
Yeah.
So let's say the ship is going to a port in Mexico to pick up, it's going to Mexico to pick up cargo for 3 different cargo owners.
Yeah.
How do you allocate the emissions of the ship empty, ballasting from Rotterdam to a port in Mexico to those 3 different cargo owners? Do you give it a weight depending on how much cargo the cargo owners will have after it's loaded? Or do you allocate it equally to the 3 because the vessel is going there anyway?
Yeah.
So there is this debate going along, and also we have been double counting, or actually in this case triple counting, the emissions of the ballast leg, because in the absence of a consensus around how to capture those emissions, the 3 cargo owners, the 3 of them are calculating the ballast legs emission in their emission intensity. Yeah. So we haven't been able to do a...
So they're taking the full responsibility or allocation in a way. Okay. And I guess the idea with this is that it is better for the climate if you have a shorter ballast leg. So that's why it makes sense to include it in the overall calculation. Ballast leg, if you sail from Singapore to South America without any cargo, you're gonna emit CO2.
Exactly.
So it's a bad idea.
Yeah.
So you want to limit that, and that is why you also sort of consider the ballast leg as part of the equation. You
exactly.
could say. Yeah.
But also, actually, it's not only environmentally wise, but also commercially wise.
Yeah.
It's expensive to charter in a ship from all across the world.
Yeah.
So what we do at Zero North is, I'm sure you know about our Charter Select module, where you can actually simulate and see the live position of a ship pre-fixture as a charterer, seeing, okay, what are my options? I'm comparing those 3 different ships pre-fixture.
Yeah.
Which one is the closest? What is the emission profile of each? And then see the commercial upside of chartering vessel A versus vessel B versus vessel C.
Yeah.
And then making the chartering decision accordingly. So we're lucky in a sense that in shipping, sustainability and profit goes hand in hand because it all drills down to fuel consumption.
Yeah.
So fuel consumption is 80% of the OPEX of a ship.
Yeah.